As the US geared up to enter World War I, there were a great many things to consider. Despite the brief burst of military spending due to the Spanish-American War, the US armed forces were, with the exception of the US Navy's capital ship arm, not especially large nor especially well equipped. Although the US had been producing small arms and munitions for the Allies, much of what you might consider to be advanced equipment, heavy artillery, tanks, aircraft, that kind of thing, was either pretty minimal or just obsolete across much of the US Armed Forces. Some of these problems would be solved by simply adopting British or French equipment when US troops got to France. But in other areas, there both wasn't the available spare equipment to adopt, and there was a need for a better version anyway. One of these fields was super heavy artillery, also known as rail guns, in a time when that meant a gun that was so large it had to be mounted, moved, and fired, usually on a railway. Or alternatively, you could install it in a fixed or mostly fixed emplacement, but then it didn't tend to go anywhere. They were very definitely not road mobile. Now, both sides had these guns in various numbers, but at the absolute high end, at least at the northern end of the Western Front, the Germans had the advantage, as they'd built emplacements using spare 15-inch naval guns that had nothing better to do after it had been decided not to complete the third and fourth members of the Baden or Bayern class, and the largest Allied guns in the area in opposition to them were British 12-inch guns of a pre-Dreadnought vintage, and as at sea, they thus found themselves somewhat outgunned. As mentioned, the one part of the US war industry where the US wasn't behind was capital ship construction, and with it the supply of large numbers of very large naval guns was part of the business. At that point, the 14-inch 50 caliber gun was flavour of the month, and thus in early summer 1917, Rear Admiral Ralph Earl, who at that point was in charge of the Bureau of Ordnance, decided that this was an area the US could definitely take a lead in. The idea of a mobile battery of extremely heavy guns had multiple attractions. It would allow counter-battery fire against the German guns, if they were in the area, but they would also be able to exploit their own long range to hit supply dumps, railheads, railway lines, troop assembly points, and other strategic targets far behind enemy lines, and hit them with considerable force. He also decided that for maximum mobility, inasmuch as such a weapon could be considered significantly mobile, not only would it have to be a railway-mounted heavy gun, but the train would need to contain everything necessary for it to conduct its fire mission. This would include crew accommodation, ammunition, fire control equipment, food, and a canteen car to prepare it, spare parts, tools, radios, cranes, and digging equipment. This would allow the train to simply be hauled into place, and from there it could just set up itself and start firing. There was one additional factor to consider, though. Everything would need to fit the width of the French railway network's gauge, and they'd have to take into account the height and width of tunnels on said network. And the whole thing couldn't be too heavy, otherwise some of the rail bridges might not stand the weight. The crew, of course, would all be naval, as the necessary training and support for long-range heavy artillery operations already existed in that particular branch of US armed services. Now, in theory, there was a brand new, even bigger gun, the 16-inch, which had recently been selected to equip the Colorado-class battleships, and that would offer more firepower, but it would also add considerable weight and size to any train design, and in any case, it wasn't available in any significant numbers, whereas the 14-inch 50 caliber weapon already had a very large stock of spare barrels and a considerable amount of ammunition ready to go. And thanks to the export of older 14-inch 45 caliber guns, which had originally been intended for the Greek battleship Salamis, and were instead sent to the UK for installation on various monitors, the general arrangements for shipping a 14-inch gun were also somewhat known. By the end of 1917, the finer details of what they'd need to design were being worked out. Things like a new or adapted elevation mechanism, as this would allow the gun to fit through various tunnels and be significantly more stable when it was realised that the existing naval elevation devices were of course designed to sit inside the barbettes of battleships, and if installed wholesale on a rail carriage, would leave the gun dangerously high off the ground. It was recommended initially that 4 guns and their accompanying trains be constructed, with 6 more guns kept in reserve just in case the first guns wore out or were otherwise damaged in action. However, the message back was actually to make 5 trains for the guns, which would allow for 1 reserve barrel per train, and then a 6th train would be constructed as a command and communications train which would coordinate the whole affair. Over the course of December 1917 and January 1918, the necessary designs and drawings were thus prepared, with contracts awarded in February. Baldwin Locomotive Works got to build the locomotives and the cars that would carry the guns themselves, and the Standard Steel Car Company was given the contract for the rest of the train cars, with delivery due on both contracts by mid-June at the very latest. Each train that had a gun with it would have 2 ammunition cars, 1 for shells and 1 for propellant, 2 kitchen cars, 1 for the general crew and 1 for the officers, a headquarters car, where the officers would stay, 3 berthing cars, a fuel car to run various generators and other power sources, a workshop car, a car that was loaded with tools and was fitted with a large crane, and another that was dedicated to tools and construction generally, but without the crane, and a final car which was loaded with sand and timber. The command train would have 9 cars, all of which would be bespoke to its role, with the exception of also having one of the generic construction cars with it. The entire battery was placed under the command of one Captain C.P. Plunkett, who had asked for the assignment as he quite liked the idea and viewed it as likely to be the closest that any US Navy captain was likely to get to live action in the war, as he didn't seem to think the High Seas Fleet was going to come out anytime soon. At first, the idea was to keep the whole thing a secret, but with hundreds of men needed to crew the trains and thousands involved in constructing them, and the preparations themselves involving some pretty hefty equipment, the whole secrecy veil broke down pretty quickly, and soon a new problem arose, sorting through the thousands of volunteers who, like Plunkett, had reckoned that this was a really good way to see action, and perhaps they also fancied berthing in the French countryside as opposed to several decks down in a steel ship swinging at anchor in Scapa Flow. By April, the first gun-mounting car was ready, and was taken off for testing. Here, it was tested at lower angles of elevation, up to 15 degrees, which it could manage just parked up on the rails, and then it was tested at 25 and 45 degrees, for which the digging of a pit between the tracks was needed in order to allow the gun to recoil, hence the timber and the construction equipment that was specified for the trains. At first, it had been planned to ship the trains over to the UK, and from there they would be shipped cross-channel to French ports near the northern part of the Western Front. But the German advances of early 1918 made this idea seem less wise, as there was some uncertainty as to the safety of the intended destination ports, and to be perfectly honest, the targets that the US Navy guns were now intended for were also varying as the front line changed. Instead, it was decided that they would be shipped to the French Atlantic coast, where they would then have to be hauled along the French railway system across most of the width of France until they eventually reached the front lines. The almost 500 men selected for the mission were sent over from the Philadelphia Navy Yard in 2 ships, one that left at the end of May 1918 and the other in mid-June. Less than a week after the second ship sailed, it was followed by the first of the ships carrying the trains and the guns themselves, broken down into components. These shipments would thus start to arrive in France at the start of July, and would continue until the steamer SS Rappahannock made the last delivery in mid-August. The first of the steamers with the equipment to arrive was the ex-German freighter Odenwald, now the USS Newport News, as it had been seized in harbour. But the ship contained only parts of several full trains, and so everyone had to wait until late July when the freighters Bath and Pensacola arrived with the requisite missing parts. It then took about 3 weeks, starting on July 20th, to get a single full train assembled, and this first unit was then declared ready to leave Saint-Nazaire on the 11th of August. It should have been faster, but someone had left all the assembly instructions back in the United States. It wouldn't be the Bureau of Ordnance if they didn't screw something up, and so the work all had to be done using the personal notes of a few of the men who'd been present for the initial inspection and acceptance trials of the guns a few months earlier. It's a mark to their credit they actually managed to assemble the giant IKEA package correctly. A second train was made ready, and the two completed units left on the 18th and 19th of August, respectively. The first train would be briefly diverted to a French testing ground, while the second was sent straight into action in the forest of Compiègne, I think. Compiègne, maybe? With its first target being a German railhead. The first train was sent into action on September the 11th, while the 3rd through 5th trains duly arrived and were assembled back in port, with these arriving on the front lines in the last week of September. Interestingly, despite their large caliber, the various gun trains were actually commanded by quite junior officers. The whole operation was, after all, being overseen by a captain, with trains 1, 3, 4 and 5 commanded by lieutenants Martin, Smith, Hayden and Rogers respectively, while train 2, the first which would actually see action, was under the command of a lieutenant junior grade, one Duckett. As a general rule, thanks to arriving in two groups, the guns tended to operate supporting two different areas. The first two mostly supported French armies, while the 3rd through 5th guns supported the newly in action American army around Verdun, although there was some occasional variance of this according to operational needs. The first gun was only at the French testing grounds for a very brief time. After having proved its accuracy at 32,000 yards or so, it was dispatched to Soissons to start shooting up another German railhead. Other targets for the first two guns to see action included an ammunition dump, which went spectacularly well, and more general rail-based targets, most of their shots aimed at disrupting German supply lines. The other three guns, as mentioned, were sent to the front around Verdun, again aiming at disrupting German logistics, as the following extract from a post-war report illustrates. A glance at the map will show the importance of this target. At the time, the battlefront around Verdun ran in almost a straight line due northwest. A railroad connecting the cities of Metz and Sedan also ran in an almost straight line, paralleling the front and rendering it very easy for the Germans to shift troops from one point to another all along the lines between the two cities. The Germans had held this battle line for so long that they had brought this railroad to a high state of efficiency. The only alternative line for the transportation of troops from Metz to Sedan was a small and poorly built railroad running almost due north from Metz to Luxembourg City, and from Luxembourg City almost due west to Sedan. These railroads formed a right-angled triangle. Should the Americans be successful in cutting the straight line of communication from Metz to Sedan, it would force the enemy to transport troops by the 50% longer route through Luxembourg and over the poorly improved tracks, etc. of the longer railroad. From this, it may be readily appreciated why a captured German document referred to the Sedan-Metz railroad line as the most important artery of the Army of the West. Outside of the terminal points of Metz and Sedan, there were also major railroad yards along this main line at Longuyon, Montmedy, and Conflans, apologies to French listeners, which, as well as transport and supply hubs, also happened to have barracks, an airfield, and the headquarters of the German 7th Army in proximity, amongst other things. But of course, the efforts by all five guns did not go unnoticed, and a variety of methods were attempted by the Germans to stop them, including counter-battery fire from artillery positions, much smaller artillery positions, that were also much closer to the front line, repeated air attacks, and the occasional strafing run. Luckily, all this had been foreseen, and both the gun car and the ammunition cars were covered in armour plating, which saved the trains from any serious damage, despite a number of near misses that were close enough to send splinters and earth raining down on them and causing fatalities amongst some of the surrounding support troops. 5 men from the gun trains themselves would be wounded by these attacks, 2 slightly and 3 more seriously, of which one of them, shipfitter First Class Sharp of train number 4, would later die from these wounds. On the Verdun front, Train 3 went after the Longuyon rail yard and airfield, Train 4 aimed at the Montmedy rail yard and a nearby tunnel, while Train 5 went after a subsidiary yard in southern Longuyon. The week before the armistice was signed, Train 3 was moved up to help 4 against Montmedy, and these guns would keep up firing until the last possible moment, with Train 4 recording its last shot as being fired at 10:57 and 30 seconds in the morning of November the 11th, which, accounting for the extremely long flight time, allowed the shell to land just moments before 1100. Between them, the 5 guns fired 841 rounds in anger. Many sources say this number's actually 782, but unless I messed up somewhere tabulating shells expended per day per battery in each engagement, Train 1 fired 275 rounds, Train 2 fired 126, Train 3 fired 236 rounds, Train 4 fired 122, and Train 5 fired only 112. The longest recorded range of engagement was 39,340 yards, which was reached by a shot coming from train number 4 on October the 30th when it was firing 6 rounds at the Montmedy rail tunnel. As 300 rounds had been allocated per gun, the batteries were at no risk of running out of ammunition during their operational period. The typical ideal firing procedure was described thus in a post-war document. Upon receiving the new assignment, the battery commander first ascertained whether the new target could be reached from the position where the gun was already in place. If not, the gun remained temporarily in the old position and the commander chose the new position from a study of the latest corrected railway map furnished by the Régulateur Général d'Artillerie. The new position was then fixed, sometimes on a railway track already in existence, but often on a curved spur or siding that was built for the purpose. The gun having been placed in exact position in absolutely the correct line of fire by technical means not necessary to describe here, and placed over its new pit, all necessary cars and material were placed in a safe position from a quarter of a mile to a mile behind the firing position, and everything carefully covered and camouflaged so as to escape the notice of enemy aviators, who took photographs of the whole line at least once a month during the war. Aiming points, prominent marks such as steeples or artificially placed objects, were then fixed nearby for calculating purposes, and telephonic communication established with the nearest artillery post and the nearest meteorological observation station, a sondage station, which sent out broadcasts every half hour in radio code, which gave its exact height above sea level, the velocity and direction of the wind at different altitudes, and the latest barometrical readings. All these data were collected and kept by an officer who, if conditions prevented their regular distribution, could make fairly accurate calculations from the reports already received and tabulated. The more important calculations, such as firing angles, were made by the battery commander himself. Shortly after the arrival of orders to be ready to fire at the new target, an airplane arrived and reported to the commander for services as an air spotter. This plane contained a pilot and an artillery expert who were instructed in regard to 2 matters. The first was the particular part or section of the target, often in an area about a mile long, which his corrections of the fall of the shells should refer to in signalling back to the battery commander. The second was the position of the so-called signal panels, panneaux, which were to be used to signal back to the planes, since these could send but not receive radio messages. These panels were 4 in number and consisted of white sheets, a large one 9 by 9 meters in area and 3 others 9 by 3 meters, which were laid at some distance from the gun upon a flat, exposed piece of ground to windward of the gun so as not to be obscured by smoke, gas, etc. The officer in charge of the panels was in telephonic communication with the battery commander. When firing was to begin, the airplane proceeded across the enemy lines to ascertain whether the target was visible enough for observation purposes. If so, it returned far enough toward the naval gun to see the panel station. The big sheets present meant that all was ready. The pilot then radioed the battery, "Are you ready to fire?" The answer yes was expressed, on command by phone from the battery, by one of the smaller sheets being spread at an agreed angle next to the larger sheet. The airplane then returned to a position above the target to be bombarded and, within a few minutes, sent the signal to fire. The gun then fired 3 shots in quick succession, the fall of each projectile being observed and noted by the artillerist observer, who then made an estimate for correction of aim for all 3 shots together, not individually, the message being so and so many meters to the right or left, or over or short, as the case may be. The battery commander then applied the correction to his spotting map, found out what it equaled in yards, as all American measurements were in yards and not meters, worked out the correction, and changed the aim of the gun. While the aeroplane was returning after the first 3 shots, this correction was made, and the gun loaded for a second series of shots. In practice, though, aerial spotting was only sometimes available, and even then, low cloud, fog, mist, or radio interference might mean that the target was obscured from the aircraft or the aircraft was unable to report. And thus, in practice, about 90% of all shots ended up being made using a combination of maps and gunnery tables alone, with the occasional spot from the ground from a forward observer. In terms of the effect of these shells when they landed at the other end, Lieutenant Commander Bai later wrote in an issue of the US Navy Institute's Proceedings that the German retreat from Laon left the former targets of the naval railway batteries in the hands of the Allies. Rear Admiral Plunkett, as Plunkett had been promoted by the time the article was written, on October the 14th visited this sector, going over the ground carefully. It was not difficult to recognise the shell craters formed by the explosion of the 14-inch naval projectiles. They were easily identified by their uniform size and great extent, and some contained a few fragments of the shells themselves, from which identification was made positive. The fragmentation of the shells was most excellent. No duds were found, all the fuses functioned, and the nose of one shell was found 5 kilometres from the target. General Mangin and the French Artillery Command were delighted with the work of the guns, for when working with the map only and without aeroplane observation, the shots in nearly all cases were effective hits, and where airplane spotting had been possible and the corrections applied on subsequent shots, they had been perfectly placed. The effect on the railroads leading out of Laon was all that could be desired. One hit from the 14-inch naval guns was sufficient to wreck a railroad line of 3 tracks for a distance of at least 100 feet, tearing the rails up, shattering the ties, and blowing an enormous crater in the roadbed. Although the Germans would repair at night the damage done by the guns and thus maintain some communication, the interruption must have caused them serious concern, both when holding their ground before Laon and also during their retreat. In the way of concrete evidence regarding the punishment inflicted on the Germans, Admiral Plunkett learned that one projectile had struck a German moving picture theatre during a performance, killing 40 outright and severely mangling at least 60 others. 2 other shells struck this same moving picture theatre and it was completely demolished, together with several surrounding buildings. One freight train on a siding had been struck and one car was completely lifted up from the track and thrown a distance of about 30 feet. After the signing of the armistice on November 11th, Montmédy, Longuyon, Magien, Loupé, and Remoisville were visited, and some of the results of the firing were obtained from observation and from questioning the civilian population that had remained. The guns, apparently, were firing a few hundred yards beyond the ranges calculated from the range table, but the damage to both material and morale was considerable. The targets were struck frequently, and the traffic was stopped completely, not only during the actual firing, but from 6 to 10 hours each day after the firing had ceased. As the railroad tunnel through Longuyon and Montmédy was the only line by which troops could be brought to Sedan, other than a railroad running far to the north through Luxembourg, the cutting of this line was a strategical victory of great importance. General Pershing, in his report, states that his description of the last phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, our large-caliber guns had advanced and were skillfully brought into position to fire upon the important lines at Montmédy, Longuyon, and Conflans. The strategical goal, of which was our highest hope, was gained. We had cut the enemy's main line of communication, and nothing but surrender or an armistice could save his army from complete disaster. Admiral Sims would report to the chief naval officer near the end of the war that the 14-inch 50 caliber United States naval railway guns have done very excellent and valuable work, particularly in the recent pushes. 3 of these guns have been in the sector opposite Mézières and have had the railways to and from that place under effective gunfire for some time. The accuracy of these guns has proved greater than was expected. With a gun that had fired 150 rounds, 24 observed rounds were fired at a range of 35,800 yards. The mean dispersion obtained was plus or minus 151 yards in range and plus or minus 51 yards in deflection. The ballistic correction in this case was about 2,800 yards, and the shots were fired about 5 minutes apart. Considering the relation of the total pattern size to mean dispersion in a salvo, it is estimated that these results would work out, in the case of a 12-gun salvo, to a pattern of about 650 yards in range and about 220 yards in deflection at 35,800 yards, the guns being all considered as having fired about 150 times since proof. A careful analysis of the results obtained under existing conditions appears to indicate that a gun may shoot accurately while both muzzle erosion and considerable coppering exists. With the end of the war, the guns were taken back to Saint-Nazaire for shipment back to the US in December 1918, arriving in stages over the course of early 1919. But with the advent of bombers, it was thought that the railway gun was an obsolete concept, and most of the trains ended up being scrapped in short order, except for one, which was taken off to be used in armour testing at the Dahlgren Proving Grounds, i.e. the gun was fired at armour, not the train being used as a target. This allowed it to survive long enough for the Naval History and Heritage Command to preserve the gun car, which is on display in Washington, D.C. nowadays, although during its stay at Dahlgren, a different 14-inch gun was mounted on it, presumably after the original was worn out and had been returned to the spares pool after renovation. Where it ended up is anyone's guess.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.